The Sumerian kings list still puzzles historians after more than a century of research. These people used to live tens of thousands of years. Why would the Sumerians combine so-called mythical rulers with actual historical rulers in one document? Why are there so many similarities with Genesis, the Old Testament first book? Why were ancient kings described as ruling for thousands of years? These are just some of the questions that still remain unanswered. Out of many incredible artifacts that have been recovered from sites in Iraq, where flourishing Sumerian cities once stood, few have been more intriguing than the Sumerian kings list, an ancient manuscript originally recorded in Sumerian language, listing kings of Sumer, ancient southern Iraq, from Sumerian and neighboring dynasties and their supposed lengths of reigning and the locations of official kingship. What makes this artifact so unique is the fact that the list blends apparently mythical pre-dynastic rulers with historical rulers who are known to have existed. And here we have some examples of their fantastic construction, brick construction, and these are still constructions and buildings upright today. Now, the first fragment of this rare and unique text, a 4,000-year-old cuneiform tablet, was found in the early 1900s by German-American scholar Hermann Hilprecht at the site of ancient Nippur. It was published in 1906. Since Hilprecht's discovery, at least 18 other exemplars of the King's List have been found, and most of them dating from the second half of the Isin dynasty. That's about 217 to 1794 BC. So that's over 4,000 years ago. No two of these documents are identical. However, there is enough common material in all versions of the list to make it clear that they are derived from a single ideal account of Sumerian history. Among all the examples of the Sumerian king list, the Weld-Blundell prism in the Ashmolean Museum cuneiform collection in Oxford represents the most extensive version as well as the most complete copy of the king list. The 8-inch high prism contains 4 sides with 2 columns on each side. It's believed that it originally had a wooden spindle going through its center so that it could be rotated and read on all 4 sides. It lists rulers from the antediluvian dynasties, that is, before the Great Flood, the deluge, we know as Noah flood of the Bible. So it lists all these rulers from before the Great Flood to the 14th ruler of the Isin dynasty, that's about 1763 to 1753 BC. The list is of immense value because it reflects very old traditions, while at the same time providing an important chronological framework relating to the different periods of kingship in Sumeria, and even demonstrates remarkable parallels to accounts in Genesis. The ancient civilization of Sumer, sometimes called Sumeria, is the site of the earliest known civilization, located in the southernmost part of Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and the Euphrates River, in the area that later became Babylonia and is now southern Iraq, from around Baghdad to the Persian Gulf. By the 3rd millennium BC, Sumer was the site of at least 12 separate city-states, and one of them was the city from where Abraham came. Kish, Erech, Ur is the city from where Abraham came. Separ, Akshak, Larak, Nippur, Adab, Huma, Lagash, Bad Tibira, and Larsa. Each of these states comprises a walled city and its surrounding villages and land, and each worshipped its own deity, whose temple was the central structure of the city. Political power originally belonged to the citizens, but as rivalry between various city-states increased, each adopted the institution of kingship. The Sumerian king list records that 8 kings reigned before the Great Flood. After the flood, various city-states and their dynasties of kings temporarily gained power over the others. Sumer's mythical past. The Sumerian king list begins with the very origin of kingship, which is seen as a divine institution. Quote, the kingship had descended from heaven, end quote. The rulers in the earliest dynasties are represented as reigning fantastically long periods. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridug. In Eridug, Alulim became the king. He ruled for 28,800 years. Al-Aljar ruled for 36,000 years. Two kings, they ruled for 64,800 years. I mean, that's an incredibly long time. Can you imagine? Some of the rulers mentioned in the early lists, such as Etana, Lugal Banda, and Gilgamesh, are mythical or legendary figures whose heroic feats are subjects of a series of Sumerian and Babylonian narrative compositions. The earliest names 8 kings. The early list names 8 kings with a total of 241,200 years from the time when kingship descended from heaven, quote unquote. Why does it have to be descended from heaven? It came from somewhere else, obviously. To the time when the flood swept over the land, and once more the kingship was lowered from heaven after the flood. Interpretation of long reigns. The amazingly long tenure of the early kings has provoked many attempts at interpretation. At one extreme is the complete dismissal of the astronomically large figures as completely artificial, and the view that they are unworthy of serious consideration. At the other extreme, it's the belief that the numbers have a basis in reality and that the early kings were indeed gods who were capable of living much longer than humans. Or in this way, we can think of them being something, we would say, superhuman. Now, in being between the two extremes is the hypothesis that the figures represent relative power, triumph, or importance. For example, in ancient Egypt, the phrase "he died age 110" referred to someone who lived life to the full and who offered an important contribution to society. In the same way, the extreme long periods of reign of the early kings may represent how incredibly important they were perceived as being in the eyes of the people. This does not explain, however, why the periods of tenure later switched to realistic time periods. Well, let's remember the Bible. I mean, Methuselah and before him, they lived for hundreds of years. And something happened after the flood. For example, the geology of the earth changed, the atmosphere changed. Before the flood, we never had rainbows. Something happened to change the atmosphere and the sun's intensity, giving us rainbows after that. And after that, of course, the longevity of humans was shortened. So between the two extremes, the figures represent relative power, they thought. Now, related to the perspective is the belief that although the early kings are historically unattested, this does not preclude their possible correspondence with historical rulers who were later mythicized. And finally, some scholars have sought to explain the figures through a mathematical investigation and interpretation. Relation to Genesis. Some scholars, for example Wood in 2003, have drawn attention to the fact that there are remarkable similarities between the Sumerian king list and accounts in Genesis. For example, Genesis tells a story of the great flood and Noah's efforts to save all the species of animals on earth from destruction. Likewise, in the Sumerian king list, there is a discussion of a great deluge, quote, the flood swept over the earth, end quote. The Sumerian king list provides a list of 8 kings. Some versions have 10, who reigned for long periods of time before the flood, ranging from 18,600 to 43,200 years. It's similar to Genesis 5, where the generations from creation to the flood are recorded. Interestingly, between Adam and Noah, there are 8 generations, just as there are 8 kings between the beginning of kingship and the flood in the Sumerian king list. After the flood, the king list records kings who ruled for much shorter periods of time. Thus, the Sumerian king list not only documents a great flood early in man's history, but it also reflects the same pattern of decreasing longevity as found in the Bible. Men had extremely long lifespans before the flood and much shorter lifespans following the flood. The Sumerian king list truly is a perplexing mystery. Why would the Sumerians combine mythical rulers with actual historical rulers in one document? Why are there so many similarities with Genesis? Why were ancient kings described as ruling for thousands of years? Are these just some of the questions that still remain unanswered after more than a century of research? This was published on Ancient Origins, Creative Commons license here, on Collective Spark by April Holloway. Please leave your comments. Thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.